Hello. This week marks three historic anniversaries of significant events in the 20th century. The first is D-Day, 1944, that was 73 years ago, the Allied invasion of Normandy. Of course, a pivotal moment in the 20th century. The second is the Six-Day War of 1967, 50 years ago now, between Israel and its neighbours, which of course was very significant for the Middle East as a whole. And the third is the Tiananmen protests of 1989. That's now 28 years ago. It's the third I want to particularly focus on because, unlike the other two, the Tiananmen protests continue to be heavily censored. I'm not suggesting that the other two don't have debate, particularly the Six-Day War, of course it does. But with the Tiananmen protests, I saw news today, online news, that Weibo, the Chinese website, is censoring or having limitation on the number of foreign users, whether that means foreigners or just people outside China, I don't know, that can access it. Now, whether that is a sort of crackdown on the concern that people might put links to anniversary events, I don't know. I have a Weibo account and I can't access it at the moment. Now, whether that's just my slow internet or whether that's actually precisely that, I don't know. Um, I do know that when I was in China, I tried to do this. I tried to basically type into Google, because Google as a whole was not banned, but I tried to type into the Google search engine Tiananmen Square protest 1989. What actually came up was information about Tiananmen Square for tourists, because it's a big public square, but absolutely no mention whatsoever about 1989, and any sort of links that looked like they might have been promising were a dead end result. It said page not found, or um, I couldn't get any information about 1989 when I was in China, and I think that is very telling. I think this is very sad and very frustrating that this is still the situation. And I have a simple view on this, and a simple point I would make to those Chinese nationalists who insist on defending the Communist Party in this regard. If the Communist Party is innocent, or if they took actions that were necessary, why don't they allow public debate on this? Why don't they allow this information to be in the public domain for people to debate? They're robbing the Chinese people of the truth by not letting them discuss this. You know, it's quite simple. If they are innocent, then what do they have to hide? It's as simple as that. There's always commemoration events in Hong Kong, um, and in other parts of the world, in some parts of the Chinese diaspora. Of course, in other parts of the Chinese diaspora, there is that nationalism that I've mentioned previously. The Xi administration, in particular, is very adept at promoting this nationalism. Part of the nationalism is defending the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. And what I find with Chinese nationalists is they get very defensive when people say that they're acting for the party, and yet they're the ones who are really going out of the way to make excuses for the party. So you can't on one hand say, oh, but we're not members of the party, or we're not representative of the government, but then not show any sort of, not even attempt to play the devil's advocate. What I mean by that is not even attempt to acknowledge that, something went wrong in 1989, that they are hiding something. There are those who say that soldiers in Beijing fired upon when they were attacked by violent protesters. Now, there are a few misconceptions about Tiananmen Square, and I've looked at this every anniversary. I think about it every anniversary. I look a bit into it. There are a few misconceptions. One of them is it was only students who were killed. That's not true. There were a lot of regular civilians, if you like, also killed, and there were some soldiers killed. Another misconception is that the protests were simply students protesting for democracy. Actually, there was a wide spectrum of protest for a wide range of different reasons. Yes, the democracy movement was part of it, but there was also, if you like, bread and butter issues people were upset about, a wide range of issues that actually were not necessarily just about, ideological movement for democracy. There was other issues going on about corruption and about many of the same issues actually that people are disgruntled about today in China. Local level of corruption and so on. It's important to understand the Chinese politics of the late 80s. Hu Yaobang, who had been a senior member of the party, died. And he had been proposing liberalization. Under Deng Xiaoping, there had already been an economic liberalization. What Hu Yaobang was proposing was more of a social liberalization. In other words, a gradual process towards democracy um, within the communist system. So, in a sense, he was the Gorbachev of Chinese politics. He passed away. He was an old man. He passed away. But students were kind of inspired by his message. In my opinion, he was a very brave man. I believe that anyone, whether within a system or outside it, who's prepared to stand up to authoritarianism deserves respect. In my opinion, Hu Yaobang was a brave man. By contrast, was Li Peng, the general who was basically in charge of the crackdown. Deng Xiaoping also has blood on his hands, had blood on his hands. Li Peng is now in his late 80s, early 90s. Deng Xiaoping, of course, passed away 20 years ago. But the frustrating thing about this is that as it gets further back in time, it's now 28 years ago, the Communist Party has made it very clear that they have no intention of sort of lessening the grip on censorship. If anything, they've increased it under Xi Jinping. Tsai Ing-wen, the new leader of Taiwan, who, of course, the Central Committee of the Communist Party see as a rebellious province, she has proposed to help China in its transition to democracy. Those are brave words, but I think it's wishful thinking because I cannot see a situation whereby, with the greatest respect to Miss Wen, I cannot see a situation whereby the Communist Party is going to change anytime soon. That does sound very cynical, but I'm just being realistic. I just don't see it happening. Um, it is important to note that China today is not the China of the 1960s and 1970s. That is very important to acknowledge. So Chinese people are not subservient, brainwashed workers who go around with Mao portraits. It's not that simple. There is a lot of discussion in China. There is discussion within the system. It is still an authoritarian state. It has one of the most oppressive records in terms of free press. It's one of the very worst countries in the world. Reporters Without Borders puts it in the the bottom 10. Only a very small handful of countries are worse. North Korea, of course, Eritrea, probably Uzbekistan, Syria. But China is still one of the worst countries in the world in terms of press freedom. Virtually all the main media in China is absolutely controlled by the state. This does not mean that all Chinese journalists are bad people. I think there's Chinese journalists who want to do their job. They want to question the government, but they simply can't because the system does not allow it. Um, anyway, I want to use this talking point really to talk about a wider situation, which is, in my view, countries in general, not just China, countries in general need to be open and honest about their past in order to move forward. And I include Western countries. I do think that there's no equilibrium in terms of the information that is available. You simply cannot compare the level of censorship that exists in China to censorship, for example, in the UK or the US. Now, we are having a lot of discussion about, for example, in the wake of these terrorist attacks, about curtailing jihadist websites. And that I have no problem with that because that is a specific threat. That is a specific threat of violence. Um, but we do not censor our dubious past. We do not censor, for example, the crimes of the British Empire. If you want to look up about the Amritsar massacre or the massacre at Croke Park in Dublin, i.e., crimes of the British Empire, you can freely do that in the United Kingdom. You can go into Google, look it up. You can buy books about it. You can go into libraries and read about it. You can openly discuss it. People might disagree. There might be rigorous debate. But the point is, there is not a level of censorship. This doesn't mean we should take for granted that this will always be the situation. We should always, be assertive and make sure our government doesn't try to censor our past. Um, Sometimes I think the right can be a little bit short-sighted in that they have a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction whenever someone talks about the crimes of the past. They think it's, I basically take a view that I don't respect the position of those who want to blame the West for everything and blame Britain for everything, the blame Britain first crowd. But by the same token, I don't think it is weak to acknowledge that we have done things that we absolutely should not be proud of. We don't have a spotless record, and that's something we should never overlook. So I think it's a lesson for all countries. The only way to move forward is to acknowledge your past. And I think one reason that Western liberal democracies are comparatively very successful, yes, it comes from imperialism and the exploitation of resources in Africa and so on. But I also think it is a respect for transparency. In today's context, I think it's a respect for transparency. That's something China lags behind. Now, I'm not anti China. I think China is a great country. But that is why I'm so frustrated at this situation where they simply just put up this wall. The Communist Party is scared. This is not an act of strength. It's an act, if anything, of cowardice. And I think they're just terrified of people finding out the truth about what happened in 1989 and further back, the many, many crimes of Chairman Mao and the appalling, appalling crimes against humanity under the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward. I must admit, as an outsider, that's one of the things I find most frustrating about China is that reluctance to self-reflect, because they're very, very vocal about the war crimes of Japan. China did suffer a lot, no question about it. And that's understandable. But far more Chinese have died under the communist regime than under any outside foreign power, including Japan. It's estimated about 10 million Chinese died in World War II. So if we take a bulk of that to be from Japanese war crimes, it's a huge amount of people. And it's a damning indictment of Japanese imperialist crimes. But that's still far less than the millions and millions and millions who died and were persecuted under the communist regime and particularly under Chairman Mao. And the Communist Party, because they are the party in power, simply won't acknowledge it. I have a book on Chinese history. In fact, if I can just get it, if you'll just bear with me a second, if it's convenient. There it is, right in front of me. This is an English language book, but it's a Chinese textbook given to me by a friend. It's from the Chinese Foreign Languages Press, but it's basically a subsidiary of the Chinese Education Bureau. It's in English with, yeah, it's entirely in English actually. Now, what's significant is it's basically done in a timeline format. Ancient history, no big controversies there. They more or less cover that. But when it comes to pivotal events of recent history, you'll notice a complete censoring. Look at this, 1989. Hopefully you'll be able to see this clearly. The story they have there is normalization of Sino-Soviet relations. Looking forward, June the 23rd, 1989, Jiang Zemin elected General Secretary of the CPC Central Committee. October 1989, initiation of Project Hope. That's a Chinese youth project. Nothing. Nothing on June the 4th at all. It's simply not mentioned. Now, that to me is proof that there is a whitewashing of history. Now, the crimes of Imperial Japan are well documented. The crimes of Western powers are well documented. Even ancient Chinese crimes are documented because that was, beyond the communist era. But communist crimes are completely whitewashed. And I think that's a complete and utter disgrace. Um, but, to any Chinese people who may be watching this and think, oh, well, you're completely biased, you're pro-Western, etc. Well, firstly, like I said previously in the video, we're not perfect. We do have a dark past, but you simply can't compare the level of censorship. So I'm not suggesting that the West is innocent. I'm simply saying that the freedom of information is not comparable. Now, I'll close with a point just to, I suppose, balance things out a little bit. CNN has just run a story about a Muslim protest in London, protests against the terrorist attacks. Now, of course, there are Muslims who are against jihad and against the terrorism that we have been seeing. But I looked at the video and it definitely looked very dubious. It looked like Becky Anderson was basically setting this situation up, almost like a director choreographing what they were going to say in the format of the protests rather than spontaneous filming of the protests. Now, it could have been that they were just setting up the film equipment to film the event, but it did frankly look a bit dubious. Now, Chinese media outlets have picked up on this and they said, they're picking out that this is fake news. This is one of the very rare occasions I would say, well, it's hard to argue against that. CNN has been exposed in the not so distant past during the presidential cycle. There was one clip, it's on YouTube, whereby someone from CNN, I believe it was Dana Bash, I'm not 100% sure, but basically whispering to Democratic voters what they should say in that post-debate analysis that they do. I think CNN has a lot of questions to answer. The problem with the fake news thing, and I'm not going to go too much off on a tangent with this because it's really another subject, but the problem with the whole fake news thing is that where there is fake news, it then delegitimizes the news that is real. And by doing stuff like this, CNN and other big networks shoot themselves in the foot. I don't believe that every single report that CNN runs is fake news. I think that's nonsense. I think that comes from the ego of President Trump. I mean, he's just made an ass out of himself by attacking the Mayor of London, misquoting the Mayor of London, I might add. And I apologise here because I'm really, bringing a lot of subjects into this one video. But the problem with fake news is it delegitimizes the news that is genuine. Anyway, one Chinese netizen apparently said that Chinese media selects what they report, Western media is creative about what they report. There may be some truth in that. And this might be one of the rare occasions where I actually say, well, maybe they've got a point. But I'll close with this. I think it's a very sad and frustrating situation that the Chinese Communist Party continues to censor the dubious aspects of their past, because it is going further back in time, but this is still well within living memory. The relatives of those who were killed are still very much alive. And for them, the pain of those events is still very, very raw. If the Communist Party is innocent, then why are they hiding this? Why are they preventing debate? Why are they preventing information about those events? In almost any other country in the world, what would happen would be there would be an exhaustive inquiry. Something similar happened in Britain. Well, we have had big incidents in Britain, like the Hillsborough disaster. We've had other controversial incidents where there were government inquiries. Now, those inquiries were far from perfect, but the very fact that they took place sets out the difference. That is why I'm so grateful that I live in a democratic country. But at the very least, imperfect as we are, we can ask these questions. In China, if people were to have a public demonstration in a mainland city, in Shanghai, or Beijing, or Wuhan, or Changsha, or Nanjing, or Chongqing, or Guangzhou, any mainland city, they would be arrested. They could do it in Hong Kong just about, though the CCP is clearly trying to get the grip on power there. You know, they've handpicked the chief executive in Hong Kong. This is a situation I will never waver my views on. I think it's wrong. I think it's unfortunate. And I think it's robbing the Chinese people of their own history. And I think it's a complete disgrace. The Chinese nationalists, what I would simply say is you can be angry towards me, but I'm not the one that is preventing you from knowing your own history. I'm not the one that is telling you what your history is. I'm simply saying that what your government is doing is stopping you from discussing that, stopping you from having that information. I'm not even saying they are guilty. I'm asking the question, if they are innocent, why do they hide it? It's a simple and valid question. And it is robbing those people who are relatives of justice. I don't think there ever will be justice. Li Peng, who was the chief architect of the Tiananmen crackdown, is now in his 90s. I very much doubt he is ever going to see justice in the way that former regime members of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia face trial, in the way that Nazi war criminals face trial. In China, senior Communist Party officials, the only time they ever face justice is if they are deemed to have went against the Communist Party. They never face justice for crimes against the Chinese people, against severe human rights abuses, against, that sort of repression. They might face the legal system over corruption, and that's a good thing in itself. But again, the question needs to be, is that really about cracking down on corruption, or is it really Xi Jinping just consolidating power around his own base? There's a lot of questions to be asked. The problem is in China, because the media is entirely controlled by the state, there's no way to ask these questions. And then when outsiders ask the questions, nationalists round on them, like, how dare you interfere in our domestic affairs? You're a foreigner, what do you know? You're a biased Westerner, etc., etc. What I would say is, so long as your media is entirely controlled by the state, outsiders have to ask these questions, or Chinese diaspora, people from the Chinese diaspora need to ask these questions. That's why I 100% support the protests in Hong Kong, the anniversary commemorations. Why? Because if they're not held there, they'll be held nowhere. And there's no other way to remember the victims. I'll leave it there. It's a few things to think about. Thanks for watching.